In May 1966, the Royal Australian Navy's Clearance Diving Team No. 1 briefly deployed to Vietnam to collaborate with US Navy divers. Nearly a year later, the Australian government announced the official deployment of Clearance Diving Team No. 3, formed from members of the two existing teams, Clearance Diving Team No. 1 and 2. Following additional training, Clearance Diving Team No. 3 arrived in Vietnam on February 6, 1967. Clearance Diving Team No. 3's primary mission in Vietnam involved clearing rivers and shipping channels of mines and booby traps set by the Viet Cong. Now, the rivers in Vietnam have very poor visibility underwater, which must have significantly complicated their operations. Another key responsibility was Operation Stable Door, a mission aimed at protecting South Vietnamese ports and military shipping from sabotage. As part of this operation, Clearance Diving Team No. 3 conducted approximately 7,500 ship searches to secure Australian Army water transport and other vessels from potential threats. While Clearance Diving Team No. 3 primarily operated as an independent unit, some of its personnel were temporarily attached to US Navy diving teams. These exchanges provided valuable experience and exposure to different techniques used by their American counterparts. Among the most unusual requests for assistance was one from the US Army's 36th Evacuation Hospital, where a patient had ingested C4 explosive, underscoring the wide-ranging nature of the tasks faced by the clearance divers. In March 1967, just 1 month after the deployment of the Clearance Diving Team to Vietnam, the Minister for the Navy, Don Chip, announced that HMAS Hobart, the newly commissioned guided missile destroyer, would join the US 7th Fleet to support operations off the coast of Vietnam. HMAS Hobart departed Sydney on March 7, 1967 and arrived at the US Naval Base in Subic Bay on March 15th, marking the beginning of a 6-month rotation of Royal Australian Navy destroyers that continued until October 1971. All of the Royal Australian Navy's guided missile destroyers, as well as a daring-class destroyer HMAS Vendetta, deployed to Vietnam during the war. HMAS Hobart and Perth each made 3 deployments, while HMAS Brisbane completed 2. Over the course of these operations, the destroyers fired more than 100,000 rounds of ammunition in support of military actions, covering a combined distance of nearly 400,000 miles. The destroyers participated in Operation Sea Dragon. Operation Sea Dragon was a series of US-led naval operations which commenced in October 1966. The primary objectives were to disrupt North Vietnam's sea lanes of communication and supply routes to the south of the country, as well as to destroy land-based targets using naval gunfire. At various points, Royal Australian Navy commanders were entrusted with leading these operations, commanding both Australian and US Navy assets. Additional tasks included screening US aircraft carriers stationed at Yankee Station. Yankee Station, officially known as Point Yankee, was a fixed point off the coast of Vietnam where US Navy aircraft carriers and their support ships operated during the war. The Australian ships were also expected to carry out a variety of other missions, such as overseeing the return of North Vietnamese prisoners of war, which was one of the duties performed by HMAS Perth during her second deployment. It is interesting to note that HMAS Vendetta, which served in Vietnam from September 1969 to April 1970, was the only Australian-built destroyer deployed in the conflict. In contrast, the 3 Perth-class guided missile destroyers were all built in the United States, as they were modified versions of the Charles Adams-class guided missile destroyers. On several occasions, the Royal Australian Navy destroyers ventured close to shore, coming under fire from North Vietnamese coastal batteries. However, the only fatal incident occurred on June 17, 1968, when HMAS Hobart was mistakenly attacked by US Air Force aircraft, resulting in the deaths of 2 sailors and wounding several others. The ship returned to Subic Bay for repairs. Throughout their deployments, the Australian destroyers received logistical support from US Navy replenishment ships. They also made regular visits to ports in Singapore, Hong Kong, and the Philippines for maintenance, crew rest, and shore leave. Members of Australia's Fleet Air Arm served with the US Army's 135th Assault Helicopter Company at Vung Tau and the Royal Australian Air Force's 9th Squadron. Operating as a Royal Australian Navy Helicopter Flight Vietnam, they used Bell Huey Iroquois helicopters. The first contingent of pilots and support personnel arrived in Vietnam on October 16, 1967, and were quickly integrated into the 135th Assault Helicopter Company, which was designated as an experimental military unit. The Royal Australian Navy Helicopter Flight Vietnam experienced its first loss on February 22, 1968, when Lieutenant Commander Vickers succumbed to his wounds after his aircraft was hit by ground fire. Throughout their time in Vietnam, members of the Royal Australian Navy Fleet Air Arm provided crucial tactical airlift and gunship support to Australian and Allied forces, playing a key role in combat operations. In addition to their combat roles, members of the Royal Australian Navy provided vital medical and support services during the Vietnam War. Some Royal Australian Navy personnel were stationed at the Headquarters Australian Forces Vietnam, while others served as detached medical officers. These Royal Australian Navy doctors were assigned to the 1st Australian Field Hospital, as well as US Army and Navy hospitals. While serving in these medical capacities, Navy doctors also participated in the Medical Civil Action Program, which extended essential medical support to the local civilian population, further contributing to humanitarian efforts during the conflict. In April 1971, Prime Minister John Gorton announced the reduction of Australian forces in Vietnam, marking the beginning of the withdrawal process. As part of these efforts, the Royal Australian Navy's clearance divers were withdrawn in May, followed by the Royal Australian Navy Helicopter Flight Vietnam in June. The final Royal Australian Navy destroyer to serve on the gun line, HMAS Brisbane, returned to Sydney on October 15, 1971. The transport vessel Jeopardy completed its last voyage, arriving in Sydney on March 11, 1972, followed by HMAS Sydney the next day. The new Whitlam Labour government, elected on December 2, 1972, completed the withdrawal by recalling all remaining Australian forces and ending military aid to South Vietnam. Over the course of the Royal Australian Navy's 10-year involvement in the war, 8 personnel and sailors lost their lives, while 46 others were wounded. The dedication and professionalism of the Royal Australian Navy personnel throughout the war earned them the respect of their allies and upheld the proud traditions of Australian sailors established in previous conflicts.